Hello, everyone. I so wish I could be there with you all in person. I've looked forward to connecting with people in real time and avoiding Zoom at all costs. But here we are. There was something else in the cards for us. I'm pleased to join you all as my colleagues in this work in well-being that span across multiple sectors. And today I'll be talking specifically around climate and climate resilience in particular as we think about how we build strong communities and how we serve the vulnerable amongst us. My work right now has me in local government and I serve as the assistant city manager with the city of Tallahassee, the capital city of Florida. If you're ever in town, please do stop by and give me a shout. I'd love to show you around or to just grab a good local coffee with you. The work that we do around climate and really just managing cities in general is a complex one that I love. I get the privilege of serving the people that I live with, my neighbors and my friends as a public servant in local government. It's really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to our politics, our infrastructure, how we live, how we work, how we play. The decisions that we make at the local government level touch our friends and our lives in really meaningful ways. And I found such fulfillment in this work, even though I never intended for it to be that way. By way of background, I'm actually an engineer by training. Thought I'd probably be in a cubicle somewhere designing buildings, but this is even better. I get to be part of envisioning and putting into plans and action how we build communities. From little buildings to cities to community programming to utilities, you name it, we get to do that. And so it's a real pleasure. So as we talk about climate in particular and climate resilience, one of the things that we know, and you probably have experienced this with government, one of the best things we do is planning. We plan for a lot of things. We have strategic plans, we have emergency plans, we have implementation plans and plans about what we'll do after we finish planning. We do that really well. And that's part of some of the work I've done both in the US, abroad in Nigeria and Greece, developing plans, which is where we get to dream and put together our hopes, our fears in some way, inspire some of these plans, and we put it all together to try to frame how our world would be. But one thing I love about the work I do in resilience and in climate resilience in particular is that you can really not fully know what's going to happen. In fact, that's one of what I would say is the gift of climate resilience, even though it is, there's a lot of negativity associated with it, particularly the disasters that come about because of climate change. Now, if you're at this conference, I suspect that I won't have to go into a primer about what climate change is and the climate science behind it and whether it's something to be concerned about or not. From the work that I do, I begin from a place of recognizing that our world and our climate in particular is changing. It probably has always been changing, but the effects of it is very real and we're feeling it closer and closer, faster and faster. In a place like Florida, it's a very present part of our cycle throughout the year. And so planning is part of what we do, and it's actually part of what brought me to the local government in Tallahassee. I was hired first as a chief resilience officer. And as I talk, I'm going to get my slide up, and hopefully that's something that will show up for you all. Um, but one thing I would quote from planning is that from the prophet, as it were, Mike Tyson, he says, everyone has a plan, all right, until you get punched in the mouth. And that's kind of what happens with climate resilience planning. Even as I began my work here, you think about the shocks and the stressors in a community. You think about the disasters that are inevitable, whether it's from storms, flooding, et cetera. And you develop a plan, but it really doesn't come into stark reality for you until you face it. And that's what happened in some of the places I've worked right now in Tallahassee. Hurricanes are a big climate threat, storms, and flooding associated with hurricanes as well. But I've worked in other places where it might be, freezing weather conditions. It might be flooding, it might be drought conditions, whatever it is, there's some actual real punch in the face, as it were, that kind of wakes us up. And I like to think that when it comes to resilience, that shock in the system can actually be quite helpful. I joke around about thinking about doomsday scenarios often, because sometimes you have to really appreciate the bad news in order to appreciate. You have to know the bad news in order to really appreciate the good news, right? How bad could it possibly get, so that you can start to grapple with the effects. And when it comes to climate resilience, what it does, I think, is that it exposes vulnerabilities in our community. So in Tallahassee, as an example, we're a capital city, one of the largest cities in the northern part of Florida, and it's a full service city. We provide our electric utility, transportation, airport, all of that is provided by the city. And so any disruption in that can be really felt by everyone in the area and even in the surrounding rural communities outside of our county. But there's also been historic stressors, right? So there's a picture there of flooding that has happened in certain parts of our community that we're aware of. And so sometimes it's just gone unaddressed, or people sort of start to slowly adapt to that. But what climate disasters also expose is these underlying issues in communities that are easy to ignore, just turn the other eye. And for us, it exposed extreme poverty. It exposed housing insecurities for more people than we would want in any community. It exposed economic segregation that's quite stark in the capital city. I mean, there's literally a train that separates the North from the South, that separates our historic, predominantly white institution, Florida State University, from the historically Black university, Florida A&M on the South side. And so these things were kind of always there. But again, when a disaster strike is when those things really come into stark relief. And so part of the work we did with resilience planning and climate adaptation is to first understand what our vulnerabilities are. And I like to show this graphic when it comes to vulnerability, because as we looked at the assessing what the vulnerability is, you realize that even though everyone might be exposed to the same climate risk, that is storm, flooding, whatever might be the actual shock to the system, the vulnerability goes much deeper, and it is different. So this picture shows, if we were to imagine, these are 3 buildings that are along perhaps a coast. They might all be exposed to the same climate risk of flooding or extreme flooding or sea level rise. But by design, each of these homes are going to be facing different types of vulnerability. You know, some of them are 2 stories, and so maybe the extent of disaster or destruction was going to be only at the garage level. Maybe they're willing to lose that. Others might be fully elevated with a building design that is more resilient, so maybe they won't suffer any consequence or damage. But then you have the house in the middle, for example, which is right at the ground level. It is exposed and is particularly vulnerable. But one other layer that we often don't go is to understand who is in these spaces. And that's where a lot of my work centers around who is most vulnerable, because inside each of these homes, the vulnerability is different depending on the person's demographics, right? Their age, their socioeconomic status, any illness or disability. And so somebody who may be in a strong building might still be more vulnerable if they have a mobility challenge, right? If they don't have the finances to be able to escape in the period of evacuation. All of that may be unknown. And so we have to be challenged to dig deep, to understand who our community is, to understand their particular vulnerabilities, and to plan around the most vulnerable. And I do believe wholly that once you do plan around the most vulnerable, the outcome ends up being better, not just for them, but really for the entire community. And so in Tallahassee, some of the examples that we've iterated on over decades, really, but it's starting to gel together really well, is building infrastructure that we can get multiple bangs for the buck, so to speak. At the top left corner is Cascade Park. It's a gem. It is in the center of our city, and it is a revitalization of a toxic EPA dump site. that was used for multiple utility uses in the past, but it's also literally the center of Tallahassee. There's a meridian marker right there that marks the middle where the old Floridians met between Jacksonville and Pensacola and declared the place to be the capital. You wouldn't recognize it if you saw pictures from decades ago. Right now, it is basically a stormwater facility that is disguised as a park. And so many people enjoy it, but they don't even get to see the extensive infrastructure underground that addresses flooding that's been historic in the downtown corridor, but also cleaning the ecosystem and retaining water in the way that helps us to treat it before it percolates into our precious underground water system. So that's just one example there. We've also implemented a lot of public safety programming that really address the root causes of insecurity and vulnerability, whether that be adverse childhood experiences that lead to trauma and mental health issues, or just creating spaces that feel safe so neighbors can actually walk around and feel like this is a place where they can enjoy, they can bring their full selves, they can be protected, and their children can thrive. We're also transitioning our energy system completely to renewable energy, and that is looking towards the future where we can live off of fossil fuels. And we are blessed to be able to have our own utility that we manage. And so we have a lot of freedom to make such a bold declaration that we will completely transition, but that we can put our money and our community resources where our mouths is. And finally, to integrate this everywhere that we get the chance, whether it's in more planning, whether it's in our capital improvement plans with our neighborhood programming strategies. We want to find ways not just to connect people and empower them, but to build it into our system so that when I leave and when the next person coming after me leaves, these things are built into the place. So there's a lot more that I wish if I were there, I could probably engage with you a lot more, but I'll yield my time and thank you, thank you, thank you. I look forward to reading all about the feedback from this event. I know that the conversations are going to be lively, so enjoy it, and I'll be there with you in spirit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rod Brenby. I'm a Regional Vice President at Salesforce. I am fortunate to lead the team that's responsible for industry and go-to-market strategy for the global public sector. Prior to coming to Salesforce about 3.5 years ago, I worked in the public sector for over 30 years. I was trained as a city manager. I was an assistant city manager for a decade in the city of Lawrence, Kansas. And then I worked for the succeeding 16 years as a cabinet member for 4 governors across 2 states, leading 2 state agencies. But the reason why I'm having this conversation is because I'm not going to be able to be with you in person for what I believe is a consequential and very important gathering. Last week, I tested positive for COVID, so I decided to share a point of view with you virtually. If you have questions or thought about the content, please don't hesitate to reach out to me by email, rbremby, RBREMBY, @gmail.com, or ring me up, 785-550-3465. I'm going to advance the slide, and I'm going to probably go off camera. There we go. So before I begin, I want to thank you all for what you do, and more importantly, for answering the call to lead. I can't overstate the importance of this work, as the quality of our futures and those of our children's children depend on it. My wife and I have a blended family of 7 kids and 12 grandkids, ranging in ages from 9 months to 22 years of age. My skin in the game is to ensure a future for them where they're not overly burdened by the challenges that we leave for them. Howard Thurman, a great theologian, opened a commencement address by speaking to the sound of the genuine. He said, "There is something in every one of you that waits, and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. If you cannot hear it, you will never find whatever it is you're searching. And if you hear it and then do not follow it, it was better that you had never been born. Each of you has heard and followed the sound of the genuine. Thank you for your efforts to help make the world a little better than you found it. 15 years ago, with those words, I began to describe my decision to reject a permit for twin 700 megawatt coal fired generators in Kansas. This $3.6 billion 1,400 megawatt facility would have been the largest coal plant constructed west of the Mississippi River. With this action, I became the first public official to reject a coal plant permit because of climate change concerns. I believe the plant's carbon dioxide emissions would have contributed to climate change and damaged the environment. The proposed coal plant would have added more than 330 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere over its operating life. That's the equivalent of CO2 emissions from 54 million passenger cars. It would take about 255 million seedlings grown for 10 years to sequester or remove the annual amount of CO2 produced by the coal plant. Over the next 2 years, the Kansas legislature passed 4 bills to try to approve or force approval of the plant, some of which attempted to remove my statutory authority as Secretary of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Courageously, Governor Kathleen Sebelius vetoed each bill, and subsequent attempts to override her vetoes failed. Climate change is a present threat. Our inability to aggressively address climate change over the last 15 years has changed the calculus of climate variability. We've increasingly witnessed the harmful effects of climate change, not as a distant danger, but a very real and present threat to global public health and well-being. Global emissions reductions goals came into focus at the 2009 United Nations Climate Change Conference. Motivated by a belief that climate change was one of the greatest challenges of the present day, participants agreed that global mean temperature increases needed to be kept below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Those goals became more clear 6 years later at the 2015 Paris Climate Accords. An agreement was reached to establish a temperature target of limiting temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade, with an eye on staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade to reduce the most harmful effects of climate change. Achieving these emissions targets would require reducing emissions as rapidly as possible and becoming net zero by no later than 2050. Our path to global net zero emissions by 2050 means we have to cut our emissions by some 50% by 2030. Despite ambitious global plans to cut emissions, we're still on track to exceed 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The Earth is already 1.1 degrees Celsius hotter than it was 150 years ago. A world with global temperatures above 1.5 degrees Celsius would be a world we've never faced. We could expect more intense rainfall and stronger storms. Warmer ocean temperatures will spawn hurricanes that rapidly intensify and have greater or increased duration. Heat waves striking areas unaccustomed to prolonged high temperatures will threaten human life and well-being and the ability to maintain agricultural production. With sea level rise resulting from melting glaciers, the combination of events is likely to produce the greatest mass migration ever known. A recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report projects global climate displacement and migration reaching 72 million people by 2050. Annually, by comparison, the U.S. welcomes 1.1 million immigrants. By comparison, it's estimated that some 8 million Ukrainians have been displaced since the beginning of the Russian invasion. These effects will fall disproportionately on the marginalized and the poor here in the US and around the world. Recently, ahead of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference, the UN Environment Programme reported that there is no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius in place, and a reduction of global emissions by 50% by 2030, that's just 8 short years away, is needed to achieve the 1.5% degrees centigrade target to avoid catastrophic weather events around the world. This is a tall order, and our window to avoid the worst impacts of climate change is closing rapidly. Last year in the US, we experienced 20 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. This was the second most ever recorded and the third most in total cost at $145 billion. What was perhaps most stunning was the diversity of events. Winter storms, wildfires across 7 states, drought and heat, floods, tropical cyclones, and tornadoes in December. This slide depicts billion-dollar extreme weather events over just the first 2 decades of the century. President Biden has articulated that the world beyond 1.5 degrees means more frequent and intense fires, floods, droughts, heat waves, and hurricanes tearing through communities, ripping away lives and livelihoods, increasingly dire impacts to our public health. Under-resourced and overburdened people are disproportionately affected. Last year, the EPA published a report that assessed the impact of climate change on the socially vulnerable within the US. What is clear is that while all of us may experience climate change impacts, risk increases when people are both exposed and vulnerable to climate hazards. The report focused on 4 categories of social vulnerability for which there is evidence that differential vulnerability exists. The affected groups are identified based on income, educational attainment, race, ethnicity, and age. 2 key findings. Black and African American individuals are 40% more likely than non-Black and non-African American individuals to currently live in areas with the highest projected increases in mortality rates due to climate-driven changes in extreme temperatures. In addition, Black and African American individuals are 34% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in childhood asthma diagnoses due to climate-driven changes in particulate air pollution. Each of you is uniquely positioned to center well-being and advocate and assure fair treatment for all in the face of climate change threats. Led by a shared vision of a nation of thriving communities built on human potential, this network of leaders is committed to systems-level change. You've no doubt evidenced and effectuated necessary change to improve the well-being of the people you serve. Environmental justice is a critical lens through which we can organize to prevent, tackle, and dismantle structural inequalities, biases, and harm. The effort to create short-term steps and a long-term framework will be challenging, but will also be meaningful. But then your presence suggests you already know this. In large measure, because there remains a fundamental gap in our knowledge of how the environment affects health, chronic diseases such as asthma, cancer, diabetes, and heart disease account for 70% of deaths in the United States, and the environment plays a role. This challenge demands our ambition and innovation because this is the challenge of our lifetimes. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, passed by the US Congress in August, is a landmark piece of legislation that invests almost $370 billion in lowering energy costs, increasing cleaner energy production, and reducing carbon emissions 40% by 2030. The Act incentivizes clean energy, electric cars, and electric homes. Additionally, the Act invests in green technology to increase manufacturing to meet the demand for alternative energy and conservation principles. This act is the vehicle to speed up transformation of the U.S. economy and energy use from renewable sources. Electric cars and trucks are expected to make up half of the vehicles sold by 2030. The state of California has banned the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035. In general, there are several actions we can all take to address our climate change challenge. We can, one, reduce our emissions. Two, we can work to remove or sequester CO2 from the atmosphere by planting trees and keeping our environment green. And three, we can support organizations that are working to become carbon neutral or net zero organizations. We need you in this fight. An army of scientists, business persons, ecopreneurs, policymakers, educators, and communicators are working on this challenge of our lifetimes, but they can't do it alone. In fact, we have the technology and the knowledge to get to net zero. The question is, do we have the will to act? In closing, I'd like to play for you a clip of a partnership that was joined between Salesforce and Accenture in talking to the business community and private business about how to partner and how to be supported in this work. We're also willing to help any other organization get to net zero.
Place, which can make the problems of the world feel insurmountable. And so our challenges grow, and no one individual feels powerful enough to solve them. But no one individual is responsible for solving them. Because no matter how complex our challenges are, they are all shared and interconnected, which means the solutions can be too, if we work together. Every business and every person in the entire world is a stakeholder in the same fight, the fight to save our environment, the fight for the equitable treatment and inclusion of everyone, the fight to achieve true sustainability across every measure, not just a sustainable climate, a flourishing economy, thriving relationships, a healthier world. Salesforce and Accenture share a vision of business as a platform for change, building solutions to embed sustainability into the core of business, with unrivaled technology, ingenuity, and years of experience helping businesses to adapt to change. We're joining forces so we can join forces with you. It's a massive challenge. It's a world-changing opportunity. This is our moment. Let's seize it together.
So again, this is our moment. Thank you for being here. And thank you for what you did.
Hello, Wellbeing Summit. My name is Michelle Moore. I've been working in climate, clean energy, and sustainability for more than 25 years. And I still wake up every single day filled with hope. And I want to tell you why, because I know that may seem a little bit counterintuitive. Because whether you're just reading the headlines or you're doom scrolling on Twitter, the news is incredibly difficult. Wildfires, floods, extreme heat, extreme cold, storms that are stronger than anything we've ever seen before. The changes that we're seeing take place in our climate before our eyes feel so big, feel so impossible to confront, that it can be very discouraging. It can make it feel like anything that we may do as individuals, or even anything that we may do corporately, is just small ball in the face of so big a challenge. And it can be very discouraging too to see leaders still arguing over whether we should do anything at all. But I would offer that there's a very different way to see the moment that we're in. Because ultimately, systems produce outcomes according to the values that they're grounded in. So if we take the moment that we're in, a moment in which we have to change, even though change is very, very hard and most people don't like it, we have to change. A moment in which we have the technologies to do it. And a moment in which, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, in the US, we have the investment that we really need to build some powerful momentum to get going. We can take this opportunity to intervene at a deeper level and to inquire about the values that got us here, right? Because again, systems produce outcomes according to the values that they're grounded on. It's not just the technology, it's our values. So as we begin to rebuild, as we began to invest, not just millions, not just a few billion, but hundreds of billions of dollars in a clean energy transition, hundreds of billions of dollars in building more resilient communities, hundreds of billions of dollars in confronting flood risks around America. How can we make sure that we're building on better values so that we get better outcomes, not just today, not just for whatever we may see in our own lifetimes, but for the long term, for generations to come? And I want to offer 2 values for you to consider, just as conversation starters, and how we may think about not just doing things differently, but being in a new way as we go into this transition. Number 1, I'd challenge us to count our blessings and work from abundance. I think we can be very habituated to working from a place of scarcity. You know, what do we not have enough of? What do we want more of? What does someone else have that we want too? Instead of thinking about, hey, you know, what are we blessed with? What are we surrounded by? What do we have so much of that we can share? This is certainly true when we think of our energy systems. Some places have plenty of sun, some places have plenty of wind, some places have plenty of moving water. And those are all sources of wonderful, clean, abundant, renewable energy. And it's also energy that we can share. And so thinking about what we have, how we can put it to work, not just for our own good, but to share with others, can be a very transformative mindset. And I would also add, in the US, because we live in such a beautifully diverse country, diverse from the perspective of our geographies and our natural blessings too, that we can also remember that means that we don't just have one way that we have to do things, right? We don't just have one monolithic energy future that we all have to march towards in order for us to have a climate that we can live in and the next generation and future generations after that. We have local clean energy futures. We have a North Star that we can walk forward together, but we don't have to all follow the same path. So count your blessings and work from abundance. And I would also say, and also offer, a second value set for us to consider as we think about how do we want to build our energy systems to be resilient and healthy and long-lasting for ourselves and for the generations to come. And that would be sharing and serving. How can we share? How can we serve? Not just ourselves, but our neighbors. And in doing so, incorporate, and I am going to go ahead and throw on a third set of values for y'all to consider. That is to serve by repairing, restoring, and doing justice in the process. Lord knows that the fuels that we've used in our energy systems for the past 100 years have done a lot of good. You know, they've helped to fuel civilization and industry and helped to create a lot of wealth and a lot of value and lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. But as we've learned, they've done a tremendous amount of harm too, not only from the pollution that's been created, but for the people and the generations of people who've sacrificed their lives and their good health to mine that energy, to produce that energy. People who have been harmed by living next door to the places that were producing that energy. How, as we're building a very different energy future, one that sustains and maybe even begins to restore, our climate, the places that we love, the health of the people that we love. How can we do justice as we're building that energy system with the tools that we have before us today? So I hope that you'll join me in being hopeful and in thinking about all the good that we can do, in thinking about and thinking deeply about how we can intervene at the values level and really make sure that we're transforming our energy systems for the long term, that we're thinking about how ultimately, for me, the love that I have for my neighbor, for my community, not just my community today, but the community that will be here, that will be connected to my family, to my friends, to my colleagues, long after we're all gone, and make sure that that love is embedded in the way that we're building the energy future of tomorrow. As my friend Ari Wallach says in his book, Long Path, it's really not only our responsibility, but I would say a sacred trust for us to make sure that we're being great ancestors with the decisions that we're making today. So I hope you all have a wonderful discussion. I hope that you find solutions that no one have ever imagined before. And I hope that you find new ways to connect, ultimately, the well-being and the thriving of people, of us, of the people that we love, to the climate solutions that we need to build today. Thank you and have a blessed day ahead.